You wake in the dark with a heartbeat in your jaw. It sits under one tooth at the back of your mouth, and every time your pulse comes around it flares, a small, hot pressure that has nothing to do with hunger or cold. You lie still on the hide and wait for it to fade. It does not fade. Somewhere across tens of thousands of years, in a shelter lit by the last red coals of last night's fire, this is one of the oldest kinds of suffering your body knows how to make. No dentist waits for you in the morning. No little white pill sits in a drawer. There is only you, the dark, the tooth, and the people breathing around you who are about to wake to the sound you cannot hold back much longer. The question underneath sounds almost too plain to matter. What did ancient humans do when a tooth went bad? Stay with it, because the answer runs straight through the invention of farming, the first surgery ever performed on a living human skull, and a lump of beeswax that someone pressed into a cracked molar 6,500 years ago. Your own mouth is carrying the end of that story right now, and you have been walking around with the evidence your whole life. Here is the first surprise, and it goes against almost everything you would guess. For most of the human past, teeth were in far better condition than yours. Dig up a hunter-gatherer who lived 40,000 years ago, and you often find a full set of clean, strong teeth with almost no holes in them. No fillings, no crowns, no rot spreading between the roots. If your dentist saw that mouth on a screen today, they would assume the person had spent a fortune on their smile. The truth is that this person never once cleaned a tooth on purpose in the way you do. So why were those mouths so healthy? The answer is what was missing from them. The bacteria that cause a cavity live on one thing above all others, and that thing is sugar. Not the fruit and summer kind of sugar, but the constant, sticky, all-day supply that coats modern teeth from breakfast to midnight. A hunting and gathering diet almost never delivered that. You ate meat, roots, nuts, leaves, the occasional raw honey raid that left everyone happy and sticky for a day. The bacteria in your mouth had a thin, unreliable food supply, so they stayed few and your enamel stayed whole. Richard Wrangham, the Harvard biologist who argued that cooking reshaped our whole species, points out that early human diets were rough and fibrous in a way that scrubbed the teeth as you chewed. Your food was cleaning your mouth while you ate it. Cavities were rare, and still the news was not all good. The other great enemy of the mouth, the slow disease of the gums, did not need any sugar at all. Plaque left to harden along the gum line inflames the tissue, loosens its grip on the roots, and over years lets teeth fall out of a mouth that has no holes in it whatsoever. Ancient jaws show this everywhere, the bone quietly pulling back from teeth that were otherwise sound. The ancient mouth had simply traded one trouble for another. Far fewer cavities than yours, and far more raw, receding, bleeding gums than a modern dentist would ever leave alone. You might think that settles the matter. If ancient people rarely got cavities, then a rotten tooth was a rare disaster, and the story is short. It is not short because teeth found a second way to go wrong, and it had nothing to do with sugar. Picture the food again. That wild diet was tough, and it came mixed with grit. Roots pulled from the ground carried sand. Seeds and grain ground between two stones picked up a fine dust of the stone itself. Every meal was very slightly abrasive, and over decades that abrasion filed the tops of the teeth down like a slow tool. By middle age, many ancient people had chewing surfaces worn almost flat, the enamel scraped through to the soft inner layer beneath. When that inner layer opens, the living nerve inside the tooth sits closer and closer to the surface. Cold water becomes a spike of pain, a hard nut becomes a gamble, and if the wear breaks all the way into the pulp, the nerve at the center, bacteria walk straight in and the tooth begins to die from the inside. The result feels the same as the worst cavity you can imagine, and in the ancient world it was far more common. People were not rotting their teeth with sweets, they were grinding them to the nerve with everything else. There was a second reason ancient teeth wore down so fast, and it turns the mouth into something you would not expect. For many early people, the front teeth were a tool. Neanderthals in particular gripped hides, sinew, and half-worked wood between their front teeth and pulled, using the jaw as a third hand while their fingers did the fine work. You can read it straight from the fossils. Front teeth rounded off and scratched and worn far past anything chewing alone could explain. some scored with fine cut marks where a stone blade slipped past the lips. A mouth that spends its whole life gripping, tearing, and softening raw material pays for it in the end. The teeth that did the hardest work were often the first to fail, and losing them meant losing part of your toolkit along with part of your smile. And in one corner of the world, the sweetness arrived early, and the record of suffering begins. Travel to a cave called Taforalt in the hills of eastern Morocco around 15,000 years ago. The people here were not yet farmers, but they had found something close to a farmer's problem. They gathered enormous quantities of wild acorns and pine nuts, stored them, cooked them into a sweet, sticky paste, and ate them all year. In 2014, the archaeologist Louise Humphrey and her team published their study of these skeletons, and the numbers stopped people in their tracks. More than half of the surviving teeth showed cavities. Half. In a group that had never planted a single crop. Their mouths carried the worst decay seen in any hunter-gatherer population ever recorded, and it came from a diet that was heavy, sweet, and constant. Taforalt is the moment you can watch, in the bones themselves, the ancient bargain begin. More stored food, more calories, more safety through the winter, and in exchange, a mouthful of quiet, throbbing pain. That bargain spread across the whole planet when farming took hold. Grain is soft, starchy, and it clings. Porridge coats the teeth. Bread packs into the grooves. The bacteria that had starved for 100,000 years suddenly sat down to an endless feast, and cavities became a normal feature of being human. Skulls from early farming villages show it everywhere. Holes in the molars, abscesses eating pockets into the jawbone, teeth lost years before death. You traded the wandering life for the settled one, and one of the first bills came due in your mouth. So now the tooth is bad. The nerve is exposed, the infection is spreading, and you are lying in the dark with that heartbeat in your jaw. What did people actually do? First, they tried to understand it, and the explanation they reached for is one of the strangest and most stubborn ideas in human history. They blamed a worm. On a Babylonian clay tablet written around 1800 years before the Common Era, now kept in the British Museum, there is a short poem sometimes called The Legend of the Worm. It describes a small worm that begs the gods for a home and is granted a place between the tooth and the gum, where it drinks the blood of the jaw and gnaws the roots. This was not one culture's odd fancy. The toothworm appears in ancient Egypt, in India, in China, in medieval Europe, in folk medicine that survived into the last few centuries. Across thousands of miles and thousands of years, people looked at a tooth drilled through with a dark hole and reached again and again for the same picture. Something is living in there, and it is eating me. You can almost forgive them. If you had never seen a bacterium and you felt that boring, twisting pain, what would you guess? Belief is one thing, relief is another, and this is where ancient people turn out to be far more clever than the worm story makes them sound. Start small, with the toothpick, because the toothpick is astonishingly old. On the teeth of Neanderthals, our thick-browed cousins who lived long before us, archaeologists keep finding tiny curved grooves worn into the sides of the back teeth, exactly where a thin stick would sit if you pushed it in again and again. At a site called Cova Ferrata in Spain, the researcher Marina Lozano studied one such Neanderthal and found those grooves clustered around teeth that were already diseased, the gums inflamed and sore. The pattern tells a small human story. This individual had aching gums and kept working at them with a pointed stick, poking and scraping to ease the pressure, tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for a dentist. When you dig at a piece of food stuck in your gum tonight, you are repeating one of the oldest medical habits our lineage has. The stick did more than poke. Across the ancient world, people learned to fray the end of a green twig into a soft brush of fibers and scrub it back and forth along their teeth and gums. Certain woods were prized above the rest, especially the arak tree of the drier lands, whose twigs carry natural compounds that slow the growth of mouth bacteria and leave the breath sharp. These chewing sticks are still cut and sold today under the name miswak, which means the habit runs at least 7,000 years deep, and probably far deeper, back through ancient Egypt and Babylon. A frayed twig is a humble thing to hold. It also kept a great many ancient mouths healthier than any belief in a worm ever could, because it did the one thing that genuinely works, which is to break up the sticky film of bacteria before it can settle in and eat the tooth. Now go further, into real medicine. In a cave called El Cedrón in northern Spain lay the remains of Neanderthals from around 50,000 years ago, and one of them was in trouble. His jaw shows a dental abscess, a pocket of infection deep in the bone, the kind of thing that would make eating a slow agony. In 2017, a team led by Laura Weyrich and Alan Cooper scraped the hardened plaque off his teeth and read the DNA trapped inside it, a record of everything he had chewed. What they found reads like a prescription. He had been eating poplar, a tree whose bark and shoots contain salicylic acid, the active painkiller at the heart of aspirin. And his plaque held traces of a mould, Penicillium, the same family of fungus that gave the modern world its first antibiotic. A sick Neanderthal, in agony from his jaw, was chewing a natural painkiller and a natural antibiotic at the same time. Nobody taught him chemistry. He, or the people caring for him, had learned across generations that this bark quiets pain and this mold helps a wound, and he reached for both while his tooth tried to end him. That knowledge, passed from mouth to mouth, is the real ancient medicine cabinet. Willow bark, cousin to the poplar, carried the same aspirin-like relief and turns up in healing traditions across the world. Clove, resins, and bitter herbs numbed the gum. People packed aching cavities with plant fiber and sticky tree gum to keep the air and cold away from the raw nerve. None of it cured the tooth. All of it bought time and dulled the worst of the pain and let a person keep eating enough to stay strong. They even reached for the sweetness that had helped ruin the tooth in the first place and turned it into a cure. Honey smeared on an inflamed gum pulls water out of bacteria and slows them down, a mild antiseptic our ancestors could rob from a wild hive. Sticky tree resins and pine pitch, faintly burning, were pressed over sore spots to seal and quiet them. There is a rough justice in that. The same sweet food that fed the rot in the back teeth could, in the right hands, be turned into one more weapon against it. In a world with no pharmacy, staying strong was the whole battle. And then, in a few remarkable places, ancient people did something you would swear belongs to the modern age. They picked up a drill. Go to Mehrgarh, an early farming settlement on the plains of what is now Pakistan, between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago. In 2006, a team led by the anthropologist David Koppa reported 11 human teeth from 9 different adults, each bearing a neat, round hole bored straight into the biting surface. These were not decorations. The holes sit on the back molars, hidden where no one would ever show them off, and several cut right into cavities. The people of Mehrgarh had taken the tiny flint drills they used to make beads, the finest tools they owned, and turned them on the living teeth of the sick. Picture the scene for a moment. You sit with your head held in someone's lap, your jaw clamped open, while a drill of stone spins against your molar, worked by hand with a small bow. There is no way to make that painless. And yet the same technique was used again and again across those villages, over more than 1,000 years, which means it must have done something people wanted. Drilling out the rotten core of a tooth relieves the pressure of an abscess and slows the decay. This was the first dentistry, 9,000 years old, performed by farmers with bead-making tools and a great deal of nerve on both sides. Then comes the piece that feels almost tender. In a collection in Slovenia sat an ordinary-looking jaw, until researchers led by Federico Bernardini scanned a cracked canine tooth and published their findings in 2012. The tooth, from a person who lived around 6,500 years ago, had a vertical crack running into the sensitive dentine, and that crack had been filled. The material was beeswax, packed into the break, and the wear on it showed it had been placed while the person was still alive and still chewing. It is the oldest known dental filling on Earth. Someone, 6,500 years ago, looked at a friend or a relative wincing every time cold air hit a cracked tooth, warmed a piece of beeswax, and sealed the gap to shut out the pain. The gesture is so familiar that it collapses the distance between you and them. A cracked tooth hurts. Cover it. Make it stop. By the time the great river cities rose, some people had turned the care of teeth into their actual trade. In Egypt, around 4,600 years ago, a man named Hesyre served the pharaoh under a title carved into his tomb that reads as the greatest of those who deal with teeth, the first named dentist whose name has ever reached us. He had plenty to keep him busy. Egyptian bread was ground on stone and baked in the open air, and it carried so much desert sand that it filed the teeth of the rich and the poor alike down toward the nerve. Their skulls are full of flattened crowns, abscesses, and jaws drilled beside a rotten root to drain the pocket of infection swelling underneath it. A kingdom that could raise a pyramid still had no way to stop a single grain of sand from wearing a hole through a tooth. The ache in your jaw has humbled the builders of wonders. When nothing else worked, there was the last resort, the one everybody feared. The tooth had to come out. There was no way to switch off the nerve first. A strong hand, a firm grip, a piece of leather to bite on, and the people who loved you holding your arms and your head while it was done. Many people simply lived with the gap afterward, the jawbone slowly filling in the empty socket, a smooth dip you can still see in skulls thousands of years later. Losing a tooth this way was so ordinary that toothless jaws are one of the common sights in ancient graves. A missing molar was not the end of a life. It was the price of surviving one. You do not need a rare genius to see all this in the record. Take Otzi, the man who died in the Alps around 5,300 years ago and froze into the ice with everything he owned. When scientists examined his mouth, they found a thoroughly ordinary set of ancient problems: worn teeth, gum disease, and several cavities, including deep decay that must have hurt him in his final years. Otzi was not a king or a priest with some special curse. He was a regular man of his time, and his time meant living with a slow ache in the back of the mouth as a normal weather of daily life. An ancient mouth turns out to be a diary that outlasts almost everything else. Long after the skin and the voice and the stories are gone, the teeth still remember what a person ate, how hard they worked, how much they hurt, and how long they lasted. A jaw worn smooth and nearly toothless belonged to someone who reached old age while others fed and softened food for them. A young jaw already pocked with abscesses tells of a diet gone sweet and sticky far too soon. Fine grooves along the back teeth speak of years spent picking at sore gums. Chips and scratches across the front teeth trace a life of gripping and pulling. You can hold one of these jaws in your palm and know, without a single written word, that this was a person who woke in the dark, felt the exact ache you feel, and got up and kept going anyway. It mattered that they fought this hard, because a bad tooth was never only about pain. An abscess is a pocket of infection, and infection does not always stay where it starts. Left alone, it can spread from the root into the jawbone, and from the jaw into the soft tissue of the face and neck, and from there into the blood. A person could be brought down by a single molar. Ancient healers had no word for infection, and yet through long, patient watching, they had learned that draining the swelling, chewing the bitter bark, and packing the tooth could sometimes turn a deadly problem into one a body could survive. Every drilled molar and every scrap of beeswax was a small stand against a danger they could feel and never see, and the many healed jaws resting in the ground, their owners having lived on for years, say the stand often held. Step back and look at what all of this really shows, because it is easy to miss under the drills and the worms and the beeswax. A rotten tooth cannot be treated alone. You cannot hold your own head still, chew your own painkiller into a poultice for a fever you already have, or drill your own molar. Every one of these ancient answers required other people. Someone had to know which bark quiets pain and which mold helps a wound, and that knowledge only exists because it was carried carefully from the old to the young for 100 generations. Someone had to sit with you in the dark and hold you while the tooth came out. The story hiding inside a single aching tooth is the story of a species that survived by caring for its sick, by remembering hard-won cures, and by refusing to leave a person alone with their pain. Your ancestors kept each other alive one small mercy at a time, and a lump of beeswax in a stranger's cracked tooth is the proof. Now bring it back to your own mouth, because you are stranger to these people than you think, and closer than you know. Your teeth were shaped by that ancient world and dropped into this one. The wisdom teeth crowding the back of your jaw were sized for a heavier, tougher diet your face no longer has room for. Your enamel is the same enamel that ground itself flat on gritty roots. The difference is that you feed the old bacteria a river of sugar those hunter-gatherers never dreamed of, all day, every day, which is why you get the cavities they mostly escaped. You brush, you floss, you numb the nerve and drill and fill in an afternoon and forget by evening. They did versions of all of it by hand, in firelight, with stone and wax and bark, and with someone holding on. So the next time a cold drink catches a tooth and sends that thin, bright spike through your jaw, stay with it for a second before it fades. You are feeling the exact signal that woke people in the dark for tens of thousands of years, the pulse under a bad tooth that no era of humans has ever fully escaped. The pill in your drawer is new. The pain is older than farming, older than the drill, older than the worm they